afternoon, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture. Before we actually get to the lecture, I have one other task to perform, which is to present the prize to this year's Young Economist of the Year. This is an annual essay competition that the Royal Economic Society runs. The idea of the competition is to get sixth formers to move outside the box of what they're hearing in the classroom, but apply the economics that they've learnt to some real-world problem. The society sets a number of potential essay topics. This year we had over, almost 1,200 entries. Fortunately, I didn't have to read all of them, but I do get to read the 20 best, which are shortlisted by a group of teachers who are involved in running the competition. And together with Tim Besley, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, and Stephanie Flanders, who some of you will know until recently was the BBC's economics correspondent. So we pick a winner and a couple of runners-ups. Anyway, the winner this year was Ellie Heatherill with an essay entitled, "Does the International Mobility of Talent Make it Impossible to Tax the Rich?" And I'll just read an excerpt from the judge's assessment. This was a very lively and well-written essay with a clear narrative thrust and an effective use of humour. The author not only unearthed a wide range of relevant evidence on the international mobility of football stars, for example, but showed independence of thought in considering the underlying economics of her examples. She drew the important distinction between income mobility and physical mobility, and she also understood that many people work where they do because they benefit from being around other talented individuals. This is what economists call in technical jargon agglomeration externalities. So that taxation is just one factor among many in shaping the location decision. Ellie is a thoroughly deserving winner of the 2013 Royal Economic Society Young Economist competition. So if Ellie will come up and receive her prize. Now, turning to the main event of this evening, tonight's lecture by Tim Harford. Tim Harford is a senior columnist at the Financial Times and is an evangelist for the power of economics, provided that it's used wisely. His long-running column in the FT, entitled The Undercover Economist, aims to reveal the economic ideas behind everyday experiences, while a new column entitled Since You Asked offers a skeptical look at the news of the week. His first book, also entitled The Undercover Economist, I guess if you've got a good title, you want to keep reusing it. It's sold more than 1 million copies worldwide in almost 30 languages, and he's also published several sequels. The latest sequel is entitled The Undercover Economist Strikes Back, and will be no doubt available from all good bookstores if you want to go out and get some reading for the Christmas holidays. He also appears on television and radio, most famously in the programme More or Less on Radio 4, and also had a new Radio 4 series called Pop-Up Ideas, launched earlier this year. Tim won the Bastiat Prize for Economic Journalism in 2006, and More or Less has regularly featured in the Royal Statistical Society's Excellence in Journalism Awards. Tim's a member of the Royal Economic Society Council and a visiting fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. Tonight, he will explore our understanding of macroeconomics in a lecture entitled How to Run or Ruin an Economy. Now, as someone who in my capacity is Deputy Governor for Monetary Policy at the Bank of England and a member of the Bank's Monetary Policy Committee, I've been involved in steering the British economy for the last 13 years, including through the most prolonged downturn on record. So I'm looking forward to what he has to say with interest and, I dare say, a certain amount of trepidation. So please welcome tonight's speaker, Tim Harford.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It's very kind of you. I really just wanted to tell you a story this evening. I wanted to tell you a story about a very interesting economist who lived a very interesting life and who thought about economics and the way the economy works in an unusual way. And the story is also about what happened to him and what happened to his ideas and what perhaps we could learn from him today. The story begins not very far from here, almost exactly 64 years ago, in a lecture room at the London School of Economics, late November 1949. And this is the Lionel Robbins Seminar. And the Lionel Robbins Seminar was the cutting edge of economic thought at the time. So Robbins had made LSE a rival to the great economics department that John Maynard Keynes had built up in Cambridge. And he'd recruited all these amazing economists, people like James Mead, who later won the Nobel Prize, Arthur Lewis, later won the Nobel Prize, Friedrich von Hayek, later won the Nobel Prize. I mean, he's trying to build a team of superstars. And these superstars would get together in the Lionel Robbins Seminar and they would discuss the very latest ideas, their very best ideas in a brand new subject of macroeconomics. And macroeconomics itself had really been developed just a few years earlier in the 1930s by John Maynard Keynes and others. So previously, we economists we'd thought about economic ideas by looking at specific things, about the pricing decisions of firms or the choices that consumers made. But the Great Depression changed all that. It made us realize that maybe the economy as a whole, as a system, can malfunction. And maybe there's more to understanding economics than to understanding the individual decisions that firms and consumers make. And this was this new and promising and very ambitious subject of macroeconomics. And it was macroeconomics that was being discussed at this particular seminar, late 1949. But it wasn't a great professor from Yale or Harvard or Vienna who would come to give the seminar. It was a very nervous, chain-smoking undergraduate. He had a cigarette always between his fingers or on his lips, and he was failing all of his exams. And yet, somehow, despite this incredibly unpromising pedigree, despite the fact that the Lionel Robbins Seminar was really open only to the best and to the brightest, LSE had been persuaded to invite this guy along because he was going to do something unusual, something different, something radical. Probably, let's be honest, something hilarious, something that the professors could all gather and have a laugh about in the bar later. But everyone had come to take a look at the spectacle, to find out what all the fuss was about. Well, the young man's name was Alban William Phillips, Bill Phillips. And Bill Phillips was a mature student, mature undergraduate. He'd been born 35 years previously in Terahunga in New Zealand. So New Zealand, as you may know, it's quite a rural place. Terahunga is the rural part of rural New Zealand. Bill grew up on a dairy farm. And his farm was the only one in the neighbourhood to have flush lavatories. It was the only one in the neighbourhood to have electric light. That wasn't because Bill's father was rich. It was because Bill's father was a bit of an amateur engineer. He was a tinkerer. He liked to spot problems and to make inventions and to fix things and to make things work better. And he gave that spirit to Bill. So he taught Bill how to make his own toys. He taught Bill how to make crystal radio sets. When Bill and his brothers and sisters were born, Bill's mother, Edith, had told Bill's father, Harold, maybe you could wire up an electricity generator to a water wheel. You could generate electricity, and at first it was just wired into the milking machine. So you could milk the cows. And then Edith said, maybe we could have some light in the house, and I could read to the children. So that's what Bill's father, Harold, did. And lights out in Bill's house would be, he remembered it. There'd be this kind of lever pulled, and the lever would sort of drag a chain across the farmyard out in the night, and the chain would sort of pull a wire, and then there'd be this peg would pull out of the water wheel, and it would disconnect the water wheel, and the lights would go out. This amazing sort of crazy Rube Goldberg contraption that Harold had built. That was how Bill Phillips grew up. And very quickly he started developing his own inventions. So the first one, here's the problem. Okay, get to secondary school. What do? You've got to get on your bike. You've got to cycle 9 miles to the railway station, get the train to the nearest town, get off the train, walk to school, go to your lessons. At the end of school, you walk back to the railway station, get the train back to the railway station near Terahunga, get back on your bike, cycle 9 miles back to the farm. Bit of a faff. So Bill's idea was he was going to build a sort of music stand on the front of his bike. So he could cycle, and he could put textbooks, his favourite books, on the bike. He could cycle his 9 miles, he could read. Right? Well, not a great success, to be honest, that first invention. But then he heard that a neighbour had got this old pickup truck, and it had broken down. And no one in the area could fix it. Everyone had come to have a look, and it all concluded there was nothing that could be done for this thing. It was never going to work again, and you might as well write it off. And so Bill got hold of it, and he popped open the bonnet, and he had a look. And what he saw was a system that he didn't really understand. But he said to himself, well, it can't be that hard. I will be able to understand this system. And when I've understood it, I'll be able to fix it. And that's what he did. He taught himself car maintenance, and he fixed the truck. And then that's how Bill, aged 14, would drive himself and his fellow pupils from the area into school every morning, and then they'd park around the corner so the teachers didn't see them, and they'd go to lessons, and then at the end of school, they'd all get back in the pickup truck, and Bill would drive them home. That was Bill Phillips, aged 14. Now, at the age of 15, Bill left school. Not a dropout, he'd just passed all the exams. He might have been expected at that point to go to university. But that was really Bill's first brush with economics, or at least with the economy, and the reason that the economy mattered. Because as Bill was contemplating going to university, the Great Depression was beginning in the United States. So the Wall Street crash in 1929 had decimated investors, wiped out huge amounts of wealth, and then this terrible, terrible destruction of economic productive potential began both in the United States and in Europe. And those forces reached all the way around the world, dragging down the price of milk, even as far away as Terahunga in New Zealand. And suddenly, Edith and Harold, Bill's parents, who'd been perfectly comfortably off, were poor. They didn't have enough money to send Bill to university. He had to go out and get a job. And that was Bill realizing that this economy, this global economy, really matters. So he got a job. His first job was as an engineer on a hydroelectric dam. I think he's 15 years old, got a job as an engineer. Well, the world was different back then. You learnt on the job. And one of the ways he learnt on the job was he signed up for a correspondence course, mail-order engineering course. So he'd fill in the questions and he'd post off the answers, and then they'd get the answers posted back to him weeks later. And At the dam, he learnt about electricity generation, and he learnt about the flow of water through turbines and pipes and through sluice gates and over dams. And he learnt all of this. He learnt all the equations, how it all worked, and he continued his correspondence courses. And you might think, well, that sounds like a pretty good job, pretty interesting job. And I suppose it was interesting enough, but it wasn't interesting enough for Bill Phillips. He wanted to see the world. New Zealand's a small place. Now, there's this line in the Review of Freakonomics. It's Freakonomics, probably the most successful pop economics book ever written, reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. And the line says that Steve Levitt, who's the co-author of Freakonomics, Steve Levitt is the Indiana Jones of economics. Well, I've got a lot of respect for Steve Levitt, but I can tell you now, Steve Levitt is not the Indiana Jones of economics. Bill Phillips is the Indiana Jones of economics. Because in between leaving New Zealand and arriving in the UK, arriving here in London, years later, he worked as a busker, violin, crocodile hunter, opened an open-air cinema, worked as a gold miner, was arrested by the Japanese, accused of spying, rode the Trans-Siberian Railway, the usual sort of gap year stuff. And he finally, after all these adventures, he finally arrived in London, and he signed up for two things. For the London School of Economics, he wanted to study engineering at LSE, and he signed up for the Royal Air Force. And almost immediately, war broke out back in Asia, and he was flown all the way back over the other side of the world to participate in the British Army's defense of Singapore. Well, Bill was an engineer, so he was put in charge of engineering the planes. And European planes at the time, they had this cool trick. You had the machine guns mounted under the wings, and they would fire through the propellers, and they'd be synchronized with the propellers. So you could fly and shoot at the same time, and also not destroy your own plane. So that's really very useful in a number of ways. Now, the planes Bill was dealing with, they were terrible old planes, they were out of date, and they didn't have this new technology. And Bill, remember, this is a guy who's basically a self-taught hydroelectric dam engineer. Bill decides that he is going to get these planes to fire with the machine guns synchronized with the propellers, like the European planes do. And he does this. He manages to get this fleet of terrible old aeroplanes properly kitted up. Now, it wasn't a massive amount of help. I mean, the Japanese swept all before them, and Singapore had to be abandoned by the British. And so then Bill found himself helping with the evacuation. He was on the last ship out of Singapore as Singaporean citizens fled the oncoming Japanese army. It was called the Empire Star. And the Empire Star was a container ship. It was designed to carry 5 passengers plus a bunch of dry cargo. When Bill was on it, it had over 2,000 women and children. And Bill was the armaments officer on the Empire Star, whatever that means. It means he's the guy with the machine gun, right? And the Empire Star was immediately discovered by the Japanese Air Force, which come in and they start trying to sink this thing, they're dive bombing it. Well, what's Bill going to do? He's got this machine gun. He hasn't got a machine gun stand. And he's not Rambo. He can't carry this machine gun. I don't know if any of you are fans of the A-Team. I know this is going to date me. But it's dated Charlie as well, I can see. So in the 1980s, there used to be this series. It was always on Saturday afternoon. This is back in the day when TV programs were actually on a particular time of day, and you had to tune in and watch them then. And the A-Team, it lasted an hour, and the A-Team were kind of like, they were this team of 4 cool guys. They were kind of like Robin Hood, so they were wanted by the sheriff, but they were the good guys. And what would happen in the first third of the A-Team is the A-Team would swing into town, and they'd rescue somebody in trouble, and they'd beat up the bad guys. And then in the second third of the show, in between the ad breaks, the bad guys would come back with loads of reinforcements, and the A-Team would be in terrible trouble. And then there'd be another ad break. And I'd be watching in this ad break, and I'd be thinking, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? How are the A-Team going to get out of this? Now, the thing is, at the time, my brain was only half grown, okay? So I wasn't picking up patterns very well, because it turns out the plot was basically the same every week. And what would happen every single week would be that the A team would retreat into a garage. And then in the garage, with a kind of montage with some music, with blowtorches and things like that, they would build a tank, mostly out of toothpaste and snot. And then they would drive this tank out of the garage. The bad guys would be tremendously surprised. The A-team would win, and it was great. I mean, sometimes, in fairness, sometimes it wasn't a tank. Sometimes it was a helicopter. But generally it was a tank. And that's what the A-team did. Great series. The Empire Star. The Japanese planes are coming in. They're dive-bombing the Empire Star. Bill Phillips has got a machine gun he can't carry. It is time for the A-team moment. So Bill disappears below deck. A bunch of other soldiers standing on deck with small arms, just revolvers, just shooting up at these planes helplessly. And Bill fashions out of, I don't know, bits of plumbing and pipe cleaners or something, he makes a machine gun stand. And he comes back on deck and he stands on the deck and puts the machine gun stand there and mounts the machine gun on it and stands on the deck fighting off the Japanese Air Force for 2 hours as the bombs drop all around them. And people who saw it later just thought this was the most amazing thing they'd ever seen. Bill later won the MBE, which back in the day used to be a medal for bravery. And that was Bill and the Empire Star. I mean, that didn't do a great deal of good either. I mean, perhaps he saved everyone's lives, but he ended up in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. I mean, he'd escaped from the Japanese for a while. He had this idea. They were stuck in what's now Indonesia, and they discovered this old bus. And what they were going to do was they were going to turn the bus upside down, take the insides out of it, and then take the bus engine and make a propeller. And they were going to, basically using the bus as a hull, they were going to make this boat out of this upside-down bus, and they were going to sail from Indonesia to Australia. And thankfully, the Japanese came and caught them before they tried it, because I'm not sure that one was going to work, even with Bill doing the engineering. So Bill was in this Japanese prisoner of war camp. And what do you do if you're Bill Phillips and you're in a prisoner of war camp? Well, you keep seeing problems and solving problems. You keep making things and tinkering away, just like Bill's dad had taught him. So one thing he did was he made these immersion heaters. You dip them in cold water and you switch them on, and you can boil the water. And he made so many of these because you can make tea with them. It's very important. He made so many of these things that when every evening the Japanese would herd the prisoners into their dormitories and they'd lock the door, and then the lights in the prison camp would flicker and grow dim. And the Japanese never figured out what was going on. It was Bill Phillips making 2,000 cups of tea. The other thing Bill made was radios. He made one radio that was buried deep under the kitchen floor. You could operate it, tune it with a bicycle spoke and a straightened coat hanger or something like that. Sort of tune it like that. But he also made, you've got to understand, this is 1943. This is a long, long time before the iPod. It's a long time before Sony Walkman. I mean, he's in a prison camp. He's got nothing. Somehow, Bill manages to make a crystal radio that fits inside the heel of a clog that he's made. So the Japanese come to inspect the prisoners' quarters and search them for things they shouldn't have, which include radios. Bill would be just wandering around casually wearing the radio in his shoe. And if he'd been found, he'd have been killed, no doubt about it, probably beheaded. But he thought it was so important that the prisoners had access to news from the outside world, had some sense of what was going on, that he made these radios, and he personally wore these radios. Well, Bill didn't talk about life in the prison camp too much after the war. There's one offhand remark he made. There was so little food that the tall men died, and I'm short. But years later, the darkest episode of Bill's time in the prison camp came to light. So he and his fellow prisoners were moved from one prison camp to a place they didn't recognize. And they could see the walls with the machine guns pointing inwards. And the first thing they had to do when they arrived was to dig these long holes in the ground. And they knew they were digging mass graves. And they knew who the graves were for. So Bill and the other officers got together. They said, is there anything we can do? If the machine guns start firing, is there any way that we can get one person out? All these terrible things are happening all over the world at the moment. Is there any way we can get one person out to just report the news of what happened here? But Bill had another problem. So he'd left his kitchen radio behind, and his clog radio had stopped working. And he really wanted to get the radio fixed. So he got together with the novelist Lawrence van der Post, who was also in the prison camp, and with a third officer, a guy called Donaldson. And they hatched this plan. And when I tell you the plan, I think you'll agree it's brilliant and perfectly safe. So the plan was, they were going to wait until the moon was new, really dark, and they would break into the prison camp commander's office, and they would disassemble his radio. And then they would take the particular part out of his radio, and then they would use it to fix Bill's clog radio. But that wouldn't be enough, because then they would realize there'd been a break-in and there'd be trouble. So then they had to take the faulty part from Bill's radio and install that in the Japanese camp commander's radio, and then fix the whole thing and put it back together. And then, this is the brilliant thing, not only does that cover their tracks, but when the Japanese come and switch the radio on, it doesn't work. So they take the radio apart, they see there's a broken part, and they order a spare. So it's the gift that keeps on giving. If there's ever another flaw, they'll be able to get another spare. Just pick it up from the camp commander's office. Really thinking very long term for three men who just dug their own graves. Well, they did it. They broke into the office, they disassembled the radio, they got the spare part, they fixed Bill's radio, they put it all back together, they covered their tracks, they were nearly caught, but they weren't caught. And the first thing that Bill heard when he tuned in his newly fixed radio was that the Americans had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and the war was about to end. Well, eventually, after what I think we can safely describe as the mother of all gap years, Bill ended up back at the London School of Economics. He didn't want to study engineering anymore. He decided he was going to study sociology because he wanted to understand why it was that people would do these terrible things to each other. Well, I apologize to any sociologists in the room, but it turns out he wasn't very happy with sociology. It didn't really provide a window into the causes and consequences of the Second World War. But he did also, while he was studying sociology and slightly dissatisfied with sociology, he did also take some modules in economics. And he was taught by an amazing economist called James Mead. I mean, James Mead later won the Nobel Prize. James Mead was absolutely instrumental in helping to run the British economy during the Second World War. James Mead helped develop national income accounting, measuring GDP. James Mead had been a classicist and had given up classics to study economics because of the terrible suffering of the Depression. I mean, James Mead was a real player. And Phillips was sitting in these lectures by James Mead and watching James Mead draw these equations on the blackboard. And he recognized them. He recognized them from his time studying engineering, and in particular his time working on a hydroelectric dam. So these are differential equations. You know, economists love differential equations. They loved differential equations in the 1940s. They still love differential equations. And these differential equations were covering the rates of change in the economy, rates of flow, but they could equally be used to describe rates of flow through a hydroelectric dam. Same maths. That gave Bill an idea. And he went to James Mead. And you've got to remember, he's failing all of his exams at this point. So if you're ever failing any of your exams, you could try this as a strategy. I'm not sure it's going to work. He goes to Mead, and he says, I can rework your textbook differential equations as a study in plumbing. And Mead, to his enormous credit, says, okay, off you go. So that summer, Bill Phillips disappears into where? A garage, of course. Time for another 18 moment. He disappears into a garage in Croydon. with another economist, a guy who's a year older, a guy called Walter Newlin. And they build a machine. And it's this machine that Bill Phillips is trying to showcase in late November 1949. It's this machine that all of these great economics professors have come to laugh at and point at and sort of call Bill crazy. And the machine that Bill unveils, this is a big moment for him. He wants to be an academic. He doesn't want to go back to engineering. But this is his only chance. And he's back on the boat to New Zealand if this doesn't work. The machine he unveils, well, it looks a little bit like a hamster gym. Only instead of for hamsters, it's for goldfish. So it's about sort of so big, it's about so wide, and it's these Perspex tanks. And the Perspex tanks are connected to each other by a series of pipes and tubes and dams and sluice gates and specially shaped notches, and they're full of water. The water's stained pink, so you can see it more easily. And there are floats. There are these grooves carved in the Perspex tanks. So you can attach a float, and so as the float rises and falls, it could move sideways as well as measuring a lateral distance as well as an up and down distance. And some of these floats are also attached to levers, which are attached to a pen. And the pen is pressed against a roller, and the roller, there's this big sort of roll of paper that's winding. So the pen is measuring the level of the water in some tanks, and you can see it going up and down as the machine starts to work. And this is all built from Lancaster bomber scrap. All the Perspex tanks are carved out of the windows of Lancaster bombers from the war. And Bill reaches around the back of the machine, and he switches on this. Sounds like a food processor or something, but it's a fuel pump, which is also scavenged from Lancaster bomber scrap. And the fuel pump pumps water from the bottom tank up to the top of the machine and into the top. And these tanks are labeled with labels such as consumer expenditure, government tax take. There's one Royal Mint. There's an import pipe and an export pipe. And the one at the bottom says national income. And as the water flows around this system, and the height of the depth of the water in one tank affects a float, which affects the rate at which another tank is filling with water, and all these tanks are interconnected. As the water flows around, Bill turns to these economics professors, and he explains that what he's done is to create a computer model of the British economy. It's the first ever computer model of any economy, and it's not a digital computer, it's a hydraulic computer. And it became known as the Phillips machine. The title he gave it was the MONIAC, the Monetary National Income and Analog Computer, the Phillips machine. And within about 5 minutes of explaining this amazing machine to a bunch of academics whose jaws had just dropped, the talk very quickly turned to how it was that they were going to be able to get this undergraduate who kept failing his exams a professorship at the London School of Economics. That was Bill Phillips and his machine, and I love the Phillips machine. I love the idea of the Phillips machine. I love the ambition of the Phillips machine, because I've recently been trying to write and to think and to talk about macroeconomics, which is hard. I mean, you're probably familiar with the difference. So, microeconomics, that's economists being wrong about specific things, and macroeconomics is economists being wrong about sort of things in general. So with microeconomics, you can always point to something. You can go into a Starbucks, and this is what I did in my first book. You could point to the price of a cup of coffee in Starbucks, or to the price of a packet of crisps in Tesco's. You could point to a particular thing, and you could say, that's an example of an important economic principle, and you can see that example repeated again and again and again, everywhere you look. And the specific example contains everything you need to know, everything you need to understand about that kind of case. But with macroeconomics, it's different. It's much harder. Because macroeconomics, you're talking about a system. You can't point to a particular thing. You can't say, well, if you do that or you change that. Macroeconomics is unemployment and inflation and interest rates. And you point to some particular thing, and you might think it's obvious what the effect of, say, increasing government spending is. And you might think that's a straightforward thing. But then you realize, no, there are all kinds of effects elsewhere in the system. That might affect interest rates, that might affect exchange rates, all sorts of things are going to change when any one thing in that system changes. So it's terribly, terribly difficult to write about and to explain. It's terribly difficult even to think about. And that's one of the reasons why the Phillips machine is such a wonderful invention. So, I mean, it's part of the exuberance of the thing. It's partly this aim to say we are going to try to show you the system, the whole system, because that's what the economy is. That's what macroeconomics is all about. It's about the system and how the system interacts. And that's what Bill was trying to show. I mean, the Phillips machine itself, of course, eventually fell into disuse. They made several of them. They sold one to the Ford Motor Company, they sold one to Yale, they sold one to Cambridge, they sold one to the Central Bank of Guatemala. I mean, they made a bunch of them. And James Mead used to use them for teaching. He'd get two of them and he'd plug them into each other. So there's an exports pipe and an imports pipe. So you'd plug the exports pipe into the imports pipe and the imports pipe into the exports pipe and have them in front of his students in the lecture theatre at the LSE, and he'd say, right, this is the UK, this is the USA. You can be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you can be the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, come on out, and he'd get them to pull the levers and to adjust the sluice gates and to try to make monetary policy work in this interconnected system. And there'd be a total mess and everything would slosh around, there'd be water on the floor. Not a bad teaching aid. One of the students he called out was a young American student by the name of Paul Volcker. Got to pretend to be chairman of the Federal Reserve, later became the most successful chairman of the Federal Reserve in history. So a good teaching aid. But after a while, of course, it was replaced by digital computers, and the rubber pipes started to rot away, and it's a museum piece now. You can see it if you go to the Science Museum. It's there in just opposite Babbage's difference engine. But it's not something we economists talk about that much. It's kind of, it's like the embarrassing aunt in the attic. I mean, obviously, wouldn't it be cooler to have an actual computer that, ran on silicon, and, that would be more adaptable and more powerful. And so that's what we use these days. Now, I think the story of Bill Phillips is a slightly sad one. I mean, if you study economics, certainly as an undergraduate, you might be told about the Phillips machine. A funny little piece of economic history. You won't be told about the Empire Star. You won't be told about the defense of Singapore, none of that. But you will hear one thing that Bill Phillips did. So as Bill was working towards his professorship, he was under pressure to publish. And Bill wasn't very interested in publishing academic research, but his colleagues were very keen that he published because they wanted to get him this professorship, and he had to convince the rest of the LSE that this guy who didn't even have a proper economics degree should be made a professor, so you need a publication record. And he was just too interested in tinkering around and in interesting and quite deep ideas to be just pushing out these research papers. But he did discover one interesting thing. So he came into the LSE one day and he said, I've been looking at the history of unemployment and the growth of nominal wages, which is these days we'd just use inflation as the measure. So basically comparing unemployment with inflation. And what he found was that there was an incredibly robust correlation between the two of them. So whenever inflation was high, unemployment would be low. And whenever unemployment was high, inflation would be low. And he plotted this thing as a curve on a graph. And he said, well, that's kind of interesting. His colleagues went bananas. They thought it's a very, very important result in economics. And so they urged him to publish. And he wasn't that keen. In fact, he said later that the whole thing was a bit of a rushed job. In fact, it's not even clear that he actually chose to publish himself. There is a theory that his colleagues waited till he was on sabbatical and then published it for him. But anyway, this particular paper was published. on the Phillips curve, this relationship between inflation and unemployment. And it became the most cited paper in the history of macroeconomics. It became almost impossible to write about macroeconomics without at some stage referencing the Phillips curve. And people got very, very excited about it. Paul Samuelson, who's a textbook author, among other things, and later won the Nobel Prize as well, in his textbook put the Phillips curve in his textbook. And he pushed the idea, and other economists also pushed the idea, that this was a relationship that you could exploit. So the government's job, when elected, as far as economic policy is concerned, is just to decide, where do you want to be on the Phillips curve? Do you want to have a low inflation? That's nice. But if you have low inflation, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. Or you could have low unemployment. That's good. But then you have a lot of inflation. So it's a challenge. But it's a trade-off. There's no way out of this trade-off, and that's one of the things government has to decide. Where do you want to be on this trade-off? Bill Phillips never seemed to take this interpretation terribly seriously. But that was the way the Phillips curve was received. And then in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, a trio of economists attacked the Phillips curve. They were working independently. One of them was a man called Edmund Phelps, later won the Nobel Prize. One of them was a man called Milton Friedman, hugely important and influential economist, later won the Nobel Prize. Third was a man called Robert Lucas, less famous than Friedman, but in some ways more influential the way modern macroeconomics is done, later won the Nobel Prize. And all three of them attacked the Phillips curve, and in particular the way the Phillips curve was being used by policymakers. Well, what was the gist of the attack? The gist of the attack was this. You've got a correlation there, and it seems to be a very robust correlation. Every year we look at, we see either high unemployment and low inflation or vice versa. We don't know what's causing that. We don't understand the fundamental incentives behind it. We just see the statistical relationship. And let me give you a sense of why that might be important. So let's think about American football, or football as the Americans call it. In American football, as you may be aware, you've got the ball and you've got 4 turns with the ball. They call them downs. And in your 4 turns, you're supposed to get the ball forward at least 10 yards. And if you get the ball forward 10 yards, there's a sort of reset, and you start again. You've got 4 more turns. Now, if you use up your 4 turns, then the opposition gets the ball, which is not what you want. And so what tends to happen is, on the 4th down, teams will punt, which means they just kick the ball downfield. And that means they're losing possession, but they're losing possession, a long way away. So the opposition have to pick up the ball a long way away, and then they'll start their 4 downs. But they'll be a long way away from your goal line. Now, let's say you are the regulator of American football, and you are shown this statistical relationship. Okay? 1st down, no punting. 2nd down, no punting. 3rd down, no punting. 4th down, loads of punting. Fine. Now let's say you think punting is boring. You don't want people to punt as much as they do. What is the policy you introduce to stop people from kicking the ball away? Well, that depends. It depends on whether you think about the incentives or you think about the correlation, the statistical relationship. Because the statistical relationship is absolutely clear. People always kick the ball on the 4th down. So if you want to stop them kicking the ball, just abolish the 4th down. Now you can think about, for a second, about why this is probably not going to work. I mean, we do have some empirical evidence on this. In Canada, they have 3 downs, and people kick on the 3rd down. But you don't need the empirical, you don't need that empirical evidence. All you need is a simple theoretical model of the incentives involved. Why are people kicking the ball? Well, they're kicking the ball because they think they're just about to lose it, and they want to get rid of it, and they want to get it a long way away. So if you abolish the 4th down, well, there's nothing special about the 4th down that causes people to do this. It's just the fact that it's the last down. If you abolish the 4th down, and you have 3 downs, people will kick on the 3rd down instead. If you abolish the 3rd down, they'll kick on the 2nd down. And probably if you give them only one turn, they'll have a go. They won't just keep kicking the ball. But it's perfectly possible that if you abolish the fourth down, you have only 3 downs, you might get more punting. People are going to get desperate and kick the ball away sooner. So it's perfectly possible that your policy will have the exact opposite effect to the one that the statistical correlation suggests. And that, in a nutshell, was the critique from Phelps and from Friedman and from Lucas. And it became known as the Lucas critique. The Lucas critique is this idea that you see this statistical relationship in the data, but if you don't know the underlying incentives at play, when you try to exploit that relationship, everything's going to change and there'll be unintended consequences. Well, that sort of theoretical attack, that's got a certain amount of power. What really happened to change the conversation was the oil shocks of the 1970s, because the moment the oil shocks hit, oil prices went through the roof, the UK economy and other economies entered a recession, inflation went high, unemployment went high. The Phillips curve just evaporated. There was no Phillips curve anymore. And it was just a couple of years after Friedman and Phelps and Lucas had said, this is going to happen. And I can tell you why it's going to happen. And then it did happen. I mean, the power of this is like a thunderbolt to macroeconomics. And then think about the response of economists. What do you do at that point? Well, what economists did, which they're criticized for a lot these days, but if you understand what was going on then, you sort of understand why they did it. They turned their back on the data. A lot of academic macroeconomists became less and less interested in the data. Of course, because the data had betrayed them. They'd looked at this statistical relationship, it was absolutely robust, and then it just disintegrated. And they said, what we've got to do instead is we've got to understand the underlying incentives. We've got to build a rigorous, consistent, theoretical model of the individuals in the economy and their incentives and how they're acting and what they're thinking and what they're forecasting about future economic decisions. And it becomes almost like game theory. You're playing a game against the central bank. You're playing a game against the Treasury. Individual decision makers in the economy are participating in this gigantic game, trying to outwit each other. And these models can be very rigorous and very robust. They're incredibly hard to build. So I totally understand why economics turned its back on data for a while. The trouble is, this project that maybe would have been nice if it had taken 3 or 4 or 5 years, 20 years later, 30 years later, it was still proving terribly, terribly difficult to get these incredibly pure models to work. And slowly but surely, academic macroeconomics has started to, forgive the data for two-timing them and started to sort of, embrace data again and take it back in a new way, in a more enlightened way, in a less naive way. And theory and data are being remarried. But I think it was a terrible shock to macroeconomists, a terrible shock to the way that economic thinking worked in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it's very easy to criticize, but I think in retrospect, it's not hard to see why that happened. Well, you might be thinking, what about Bill Phillips? I mean, he did all this interesting stuff with the computer. Then he created this amazing idea, the Phillips curve. It became the most famous idea in macroeconomics, and then it was discredited. Why didn't Bill speak up? Well, there were 2 reasons. The first was he just wasn't that interested in the Phillips curve. He personally had never massively taken ownership of it. Remember, he said it was a rush job. He possibly didn't even publish the thing. Maybe his colleagues published the thing. He was certainly much more interested in, a couple of things. One was economic dynamics. So how economic systems can become very unstable with feedback loops that cause all sorts of problems. And these are things that we economists, we still haven't really mastered. That was one issue that was engaging Bill. He was a very deep thinker. The other thing was China. And Bill had become fascinated with China in the prison camp. He had taught himself to read a bit of Chinese. He read Chinese novels. He actually taught some Chinese to fellow prisoners. He was really engaged with the idea of China. He was in love with the idea of China. And this is 1969. China had no economy. had 1 billion people, had an atomic bomb, but no economy at all. It was one of the poorest countries on the planet. And nobody was very interested in the economics of China, but Bill Phillips was. I think this is really important insight into the kind of person he was. He just saw you can't just turn your back as an academic discipline. You can't just turn your back on 1 billion people just because they're incredibly poor. This is going to be important. What happens in China, in China's economy, is going to be important. He saw that, he understood that, almost before anybody else did. And so he had, by the time Phelps and Friedman and Lucas made their criticisms, he'd gone to Australia to work on economic dynamics, and in particular, to work on China. But there's another reason that he didn't defend himself. And that was, by the time the hammer blow really fell, by the time the Phillips curve had absolutely fallen apart, Bill Phillips was dead. He'd had 2 massive strokes, the first one disabling, and the second one killed him. He was 61. And it's always sad when anybody dies at what's quite a young age. I think it's particularly sad in the case of Bill Phillips, because an absolutely remarkable human being and an absolutely remarkable economist. And yet, these days, we don't remember the Empire Star. We barely remember the Phillips machine, and it's a kind of little joke. All we remember of Bill Phillips is the Phillips curve. This idea that boomed, that everybody took seriously except Bill Phillips, that was then completely discredited, had to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up in a totally different way. That's not Bill Phillips' fault, and that's not fair. But then again, as I'm sure we never tire of telling each other, life isn't fair. But there is one thing that I feel that we should keep from Bill Phillips and the generation of economists who surrounded Bill Phillips. It's not the Phillips curve, not even the crazy machine or any of that stuff. It's the attitude. I mean, these men and women felt that economics was tremendously important. And they also felt that they could do something. It was possible to make the economy work better if only you could understand it well enough. And maybe they didn't understand it well enough. But the ambition there was still important. John Maynard Keynes once wrote about the Depression, that the economy was suffering from magneto trouble. And the magneto it's a sort of alternator. It charges up the car battery. And the point he was making is, it's just a little thing. It's just a small part. All you need to do is fix that part, and the whole car will start working again. And that's what he felt was true about the economy during the Great Depression. Magneto trouble. It's just a technical error. You can fix it, and if you get the fix right, you can kickstart the whole thing. And Bill Phillips thought that too. I think Bill thought about the economy in the same way that he thought about that abandoned pickup truck that he encountered when he was 14 years old. So this idea that everybody else has given up. There's nothing we can do to get it going again. There's nothing we can do to understand it. There's nothing we can do to fix it. Just leave it alone. And Bill didn't believe that. He thought he could understand it, and he thought he could fix it, and he did. I'm very happy to take questions, but thank you very much for listening. You're very kind, thank you. So I think we have possibly millions of people watching us online, probably more likely several hundred. So for those people, it's important that we wait for microphones so they can hear the questions. There's a question here. Do we have microphones? Yes? For people? Okay. Oh, so could people, Charlie, should we ask people to come down and stand by the microphone rather than get you to? Yeah, should we do, sorry. we're economists. We can't get this sort of thing sorted out. So thank you, Charlie. So one question here. Could we take two or three questions? Anybody else? There's a question there. So if you, sir, and you, sir, could come and have we got any questions online yet, Ramesh? Yeah. Fine. Okay.
Phillips has seemingly described the economy as a system which is interrelated, and the Bank of England seems to operate in isolation, almost targeting low inflation, to perhaps aggressively to create this impression that it focuses on low inflation, therefore we get self-fulfilling low inflation. Do you think that they ignore, the Bank of England, other issues such as the housing market? They'll just dictate, they'll just set interest policy in isolation, not consider the effect that the housing market could have on creating a banking crisis, for example. Mm-hmm. They did consider unemployment quite a bit during the recession, surprisingly, perhaps more than they were expected to, I'm guessing. Do you think it's a problem, and do you think they're looking at things a little bit, not in a holistic way? Sure.
And can we have a second question? We'll take two or three questions and I'll answer them together. Thank you. Anyone else want to come down? Oh, there's also a microphone at the top. Okay, cool. So.
Maybe kind of my questions around whether microeconomics is kind of the correct way of approaching the entire problem. So if we, for example, if we look at the airline industry or look at Boeing, for example, they might build a very complex aircraft, but they don't run all the airports around the world. We don't think of all the airlines and all the airport as being one system and try to solve that. If we just enable kind of all those little actors to do their own stuff, wouldn't it be better time spent?
Cool. Okay. I mean, these are actually, they're quite closely related questions. Is there a third person who wanted to ask a question? There's somebody there. And where is the... Oh, yeah, it's a gentleman at the top. Thank you.
So you were talking about the time when economists started to take away from statistics and looking at statistics. What's your opinion on how they take them now? Do you think economists are relying too much on statistics or too little, or do you think the balance is right?
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, to take the first two questions together, because I think they're sort of getting at the same thing, which is how do we think about this system? Should we think of it as the sum of the parts? And if so, do we understand the parts well enough? The project that I was talking about that Lucas launched in the 1970s was the Micro Foundations project. So the idea is, let's get all the microeconomics right, and we understand microeconomics, and we're going to tell ourselves we understand microeconomics. We certainly understand it a lot better than we do macroeconomics. And then let's scale up. And I sort of understand the appeal of that, and I found that very appealing as a student. And ultimately, I think that's what you would want. Because the alternative is just kind of, thumb in the air, your sort of ad hoc rules, statistical rules of thumb that you don't really, like the Phillips curve, you don't really understand what's driving them, but they always seem to happen, you don't really understand the behavior. So the idea of building a macroeconomic view from assembling microeconomic pieces of the jigsaw is tremendously appealing. It's just we haven't been able to do it. And I wonder whether we will be able to do it in the foreseeable future. And if you abandon microeconomics, then that's a real challenge for macroeconomics, because suddenly you're back to rules of thumb. For instance, how do prices adjust in the economy? The simple assumption is any way you like. Then you might bring in more realistic assumptions about the costs of adjustment or the psychological barriers to adjustment. But then actually to really understand how they adjust becomes very difficult. So you come up with a simple model. So it's a challenge that I don't think we're going to solve in a straightforward way. What I do think macroeconomists need to learn from microeconomists, a couple of things that are coming. The number one is big data. I think big data is hugely overhyped at the moment, but it's clearly going to change the way that we understand the economy as a system. So the Bank of England already is starting to inform some forecasts of unemployment by looking at Google searches for JSA, Job Seekers Allowance. Just a little experiment, just to see if it works. Well, it kind of does work, actually. It gives you, and there's just one more thing to throw into the mix. As we start being able to track what everybody is purchasing real time, billions and billions of different products, as they're doing it, we're going to be able to start using that data to inform our vision of the macroeconomy. At the moment, that's only really happening, I think, effectively in microeconomics. So you've got economists at Google, economists at Yahoo, economists at Microsoft, crunching very, very big data sets. But it's a big challenge to move it to macro. But it's got to happen. It's bound to happen. And the other thing that the microeconomists, I think, can bring to macroeconomics is behavioral economics. So behavioral economics is the psychological wing of economics. And microeconomists have sort of resisted this or embraced it. Different microeconomists have treated it in different ways, but they've engaged with it. It's now perfectly reasonable to publish in a top economic journal a behavioral economics paper. That's accepted. And microeconomists who don't buy behavioral economics, who are skeptical of it, they're engaged with it, they're trying to rebut it, they're trying to disagree. What Bob Shiller told me when I saw him a while ago, Bob Shiller, who was one of the Nobel Prize winners this year, very famous behavioral economist and behavioral finance guy, he's been trying to bring behavioral economics into macro, to run seminars where macroeconomists engage with behavioral ideas, which are clearly hugely important because they govern how prices change, they govern whether people will accept jobs at certain kind of wages, they might govern the risk premium, how willing people are to invest. And his take was that they just weren't ready yet. The macroeconomists, they didn't even want to disagree. They just didn't show up. They weren't interested in having the conversation. Which brings us to this conversation about the Bank of England. I mean, my impression of the Bank of England is it's a very it's a place that is willing to explore a lot of different ideas. We have certain members of the Bank of England exploring all sorts of ideas from complexity science, from biology, evolutionary biology, psychology. I mean, Andrew Haldane is almost absurdly pluralistic. I think some people would probably wish he would stop being quite so pluralistic, although we journalists love reading Andrew Haldane's speeches. The question is, what does that contribute to the core purpose of the Bank of England and particularly the Monetary Policy Committee? It's not easy to know. I've never sat on the MPC. I don't know what they discuss. Yeah, I don't know what they discuss, but I'm sure they discuss a very wide range of stuff. But fundamentally, they have a mandate to hold inflation at around 2% in the medium term. That's the mandate. Maybe they should have a different mandate, but no. You don't argue with Parliament. Is it set by Parliament or is it set by the Chancellor? I forget. So anyway, if that's the mandate, that's the mandate. And you can be as holistic as you like. I'm sure they consider many, many things, but that's the... So really the question is that the right approach? I think we're starting to realize that we need to consider more things. We need to consider the structure of the financial system more. Question from the back about, sorry, these are very long answers, but I think actually I apologize, but I think the questions really get at something quite fundamental about economics. I think that the crisis has been kind of good for quick and dirty macroeconomics, embracing a mix of statistics from all branches plus theory. I mean, there's this statement that there aren't any atheists in foxholes. Suddenly when you're absolutely threatened, you grab for anything that is going to reassure you. And I think the same thing has been true in the crisis. The people who've been on the front line of the crisis at the Bank of England, the Treasury, the Bank of International Settlements, they've, I think, been quite pragmatic about their approaches. They've looked at data, they've looked at theory, anything that will just help them understand what on earth is going on. Now, should they have been more pragmatic before the crisis? Should they have been more pluralistic before the crisis? I don't know. It's easy to say. Very easy to say, not so easy to do. We've got, so can we have a question there? Could you come out? And we've also got a question from the interwebs.
Shall I ask those questions while
come
we're
on
waiting?
out, guys.
So Tim, I'm delighted to report a question that's come in from Robin Nuttall in Christchurch in New Zealand, who has been live tweeting your lecture, and delighted to hear about Bill Phillips. Yeah. She asks, where are researchers now using a strong empirical model to understand current macroeconomics?
Oh, gosh. A strong empirical model to understand macroeconomics. I think that So this is sort of above my pay grade, but I mean, Charlie, what's your favourite empirical macro model?
I think the important thing is to realise that all models are imperfect. They work sometimes in some conditions. They're a crutch.
Yeah, so there you go. If you're listening in Christchurch, New Zealand, all models are a crutch. They're all imperfect. I mean, I think it's interesting to look at some of the far-out models that are being employed. So Didier Sornet, for instance, who is, I think, in Bern, somewhere in Switzerland. Didier Sornet is using crack propagation models. So how do you understand the rocket boosters on Ariane, the European equivalent of the space shuttle? Sometimes they blow up, which is not really what you want. So why? Why do they sometimes blow up? And so Didier Sornet was looking at models of that, and then realizing the same model could be used to explain earthquakes. And then he realized, actually, the same model, it appears, could be used to predict stress in the financial system. Now, in a way, you've got the same problem as the Phillips curve. We don't understand why that would be. We don't understand what's going on, but the data look quite compelling and quite interesting. And I'm always in favor of, it's always good to have another perspective, another view. Even if the model doesn't make sense to an economist, it might still give us something to think about. Yeah.
I hope you don't mind me asking quite, not an off-topic question, but it's not about models. I was just wondering, I've had quite an interest in bitcoins recently, and I've just found out that they're $1,000 on the Japanese stock exchange, and I think that's fascinating. And as well as being good and almost essentially democratizing money, so we're taking it out of the hands of greedy bankers and governments with one vested interest, there are negative sides to it, so it kind of gives leeway to things like drug trafficking, and kind of there's no real analysis and security of it. So I was kind of wondering, what is your opinion? Do you think that the good outweighs the bad? Do you think it's something that more people should take a vested interest in, or do you think it should kind of stay quite underground and on the Silk Road?
Cool, thank you. Let's have another question.
So Phillips used inflation and unemployment to kind of look at the economy. Do you think that they're still suitable measures to assess our current economic health and to forecast future economic growth?
Gosh, okay. Thanks both. Have a seat, thank you. So let me do inflation and unemployment. Actually, Phillips, as I mentioned, actually looked at the growth rate of money wages, but it was a good sort of measure of unemployment. I mean, yeah, these are very sort of fundamental facts about the economy. I mean, it's hard to think of a more basic fact than the number of people who don't have a job. That's hugely important. And inflation is also hugely important. We used to not have inflation. We used to sort of have money linked to currencies. You basically had pretty much zero inflation. Prices didn't really move anywhere in general. We've had very consistent inflation for the last 100 years or so. And so it's important, which I think is, by the way, not a bad thing. I don't think it's a particular problem. I think it's actually a better system. But we clearly need to measure it. Because if you don't really know what's happening to the broad trend of prices, the economy becomes hopelessly confusing. And one of the reasons why one of several reasons why high inflation is a problem is once inflation gets to a certain point, you can't even know what it is. It's just too hard to even measure. And so there's this line from the novel by Eric Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a book you may have read. He also wrote a book called The Black Obelisk, which is about hyperinflation in Weimar Germany. And there's one point where someone lights a cigar with a 20 billion mark note and says to his friend, well, are we ruined or are we in clover? And his friend says, I don't think anybody in Germany knows that about himself. So there's a certain point where if inflation takes off, you've got no idea what's happening. Nobody knows anything. So these are absolutely fundamental. I mean, whether they're useful for economic forecasting, well, we're not very good at economic forecasting. We're actually not very good at forecasting full stop. There's a wonderful study by the psychologist Philip Tetlock of forecasting in political science, in international affairs, economics, all sorts of social science forecasting. And he took 20 years over this project, asked nearly 300 experts, 27,000 forecasts, waited to see whether the forecast came true, and they mostly didn't. I mean, we're just all terrible at this. So it's not just economics. It's hard to see into the future in a human system, a very complex human system, which is what our economy is. But yeah, they're still going to be fundamental. There are obviously lots and lots of other things you can measure. You can measure all kinds of different inflation rates. You can measure all sorts of stresses in the financial system. There are different ways to think about unemployment. So somebody who is 55 years old, used to work in a steelworks, lost his job, has a bit of a bad back, can't find a job, could get signed up as disabled and unfit to work. He is basically unemployed. You know, any reasonable person would say this person's unemployed. This is just the way society has chosen to bung him a few quid. He's not unemployed as far as the official statistics are concerned. On the other hand, if you're a student, you're looking for work in a bar or a restaurant to earn a bit of money while you're a full-time student, and you're looking for work and you can't find that work, you are unemployed. You're officially unemployed because you're looking for work, you're available for work, you can't find the work. But most people would say, well, that student's not really, I mean, they're a full-time student, they're sort of unemployed, but they're sort of not unemployed. It's hard, and there's no right way to do this. It's always hard. Bitcoin, so I write about this in my book, which is a very good book, by the way. The Undercover Economist Strikes Back. I do recommend it. Money in general is fascinating. I think the thing that people have not appreciated about Bitcoin, there's going to be digital money in the future, one way or another, somehow, whether it's going to be Bitcoin or something else. What people haven't appreciated about Bitcoin is it's not money. Let me be very clear about what I mean by that. Money has a number of properties, the most important of which, the most absolutely fundamental of which, is that its value relative to the sorts of things you might want to spend it on is reasonably stable and comprehensible. That, in my view, is the fundamental characteristic of money. So you could denominate a contract in bitcoins. You could denominate a contract in ounces of gold. You could denominate a contract in chickens or in slabs of salt or in whatever the price of a single on iTunes is. Or you could denominate a contract in anything you like. But you wouldn't want to do that. You would probably want to denominate a contract, if you live in the UK, in pounds, or maybe euros, or maybe dollars. Because the stuff you want to buy makes sense when expressed in those terms. Now, Bitcoin may be a fantastic investment. It has been very volatile, but it has been great if you've had Bitcoins, you made a lot of money on your Bitcoins. That's a separate question. It doesn't mean it's money. Money is something very different. And I think we won't really see all of this settle down until we have a digital currency that's money rather than a speculative asset, which is what Bitcoin currently is. How much? Oh, we've got time for, even given my long-winded answer. So we've got a fellow in the middle there. Should we bring a mic up, or can you come down? And we've got someone from the cloud, and anyone else? Anyone else? Okay, Ramesh, maybe you could.
Okay, we've got some questions on China come in, Tim. One from Jim Riley, who's the CEO of Tutor2You, who are the partners of the Royal Economic Society in the Young Economist competition. He says, what do you think Bill Phillips would have made of China's rise as a global economic power? Related to that question from Emma Mulgrew, head of economics at King David High School, how do you think China's economy will change given the problems created by the one-child policy? And where would China have fitted into the Phillips curve during its rise to power?
Wow.
Some questions around China there for you.
Okay, cool. Should we get, while I think about those questions, should we get the microphone up sort of to that gentleman sort of just on the other side? Well, we'll pass the microphone over. So I've no idea what Bill would have thought of China. I think, like all of us, he would have been pretty astonished. I mean, this is the greatest burst of economic growth that's ever been seen in the history of the human race. So many people, such very high growth rates over such an enormous length of time. I mean, it's been going on now for 35 years. I mean, it is absolutely miraculous. Clearly, it poses all kinds of problems, but I think that it's basically a tremendously good news story. I mean, I think it's very hard for us to understand today just how poor China was and just how much suffering there was in China in the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, partly because of totalitarianism, but partly also because they were just so poor. And so it's astonishing, this growth. What happens next? Well, one-child policy is a big deal. So here, you may have heard all this concern about the aging society. And what people think of the aging society as kind of, oh, old people just won't die and we have to pay for their pensions. It's a problem. But actually, that's not really, the main driver is not longevity. The main driver is low birth rate. So the problem is that old people didn't have enough children when they were younger. And so that's why it's now so difficult for younger generation to support the pensions of all these older people. And there's no way to structure your pension system that makes this problem go away. I mean, you can have a state pension, have private pensions, but fundamentally, the problem is the same. You've got a lot of people who are not working because they're old, and then are not very many people who are having to actually generate the productivity to support them. This is a big issue. It's arguably the fundamental reason why Japan hasn't really grown for 20 years. After being an unbelievable economic powerhouse in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s. Everything people say about China now, they were saying about Japan in the 1980s. And there were various reasons why Japan's growth has slowed down, but one of them surely is demography. Not many children, low birth rate, very elderly population. So this stuff really, really matters. And China's had this one-child policy for a long time where, I mean, it's not absolutely strict that it's one child per family. There are various exceptions, but fundamentally it means that there is no society in history that has ever aged as quickly as China is currently aging. It's a big problem. And I don't know what they're going to do about it. There's no simple solutions. As for China's growth in future, I don't know. The thing about China that I think people don't fully appreciate, something that I've tried to stress in several of my books, is how experimental China's growth has been. So Deng Xiaoping, who was the great Chinese reformer at the end of the 1970s and through the 1980s, who really modernized China's economy, a lot of that modernization was, oh, somebody's tried something, let's see if it works. Oh, it works. Everybody copy that. Let's try something else. Let's try a new way of structuring our industrial system. Let's try a new way of structuring our agricultural system. Let's try it on the coast. Let's try a few new cities, see what happens there. Or if it works, let's copy that. So there's been this constant experimentation. And Deng Xiaoping said, we're crossing the river by feeling for stones. I love the image, the idea of somebody walking over and there are stepping stones, but they're under the water. And you can't see them, and you're just feeling, you're trying to put your foot and find this safe ground. And then maybe one day there won't be another stone for the Chinese system to step onto. Or maybe the stone will be so far away they have to leap, and maybe they'll hit it, maybe they won't. Or maybe the rivers get so fast it'll wash them away. I don't know. But that's going to be the challenge. Has the growth got so big and so powerful that trial and error no longer works? Yeah, chat there.
Yeah. So just a few hours ago, during Prime Minister's question times, the House of Commons discussed what to do about rising energy bills. The coalition government, they suggested that we just leave it as it is and wrap up warmer, whilst companies enjoy profits of around 70%, and increased profits of around 70%. And the Labour government, they suggest that we cap them. But what do we do on the 19th month? So Philip suggested there's a problem for every solution, a solution for every problem. So what do we do about this problem? And do you think, as an economist, do you think solving issues the way the House of Commons choose to do so is efficient?
We don't have the House of Commons to be efficient. That's not why they're there. They're a safety release. So when we are absolutely fed up of them, we kick them all out. We get some new guys in, but they're not there to be efficient. I don't think. I think it's impossible that we would ever have an efficient democratic system. I think we just have to accept that's the price we pay for freedom and for democratic influence. I mean, what to do about rising energy bills? So there was a slip of the tongue. You said for every solution there's a problem. I mean, there's sort of it is useful to try to figure out what we think the problem actually is. And I think the issue is there are a number of possible problems. So there's a distributional issue, which is that a lot of people have really struggled over the past few years. In fact, if and I don't want to get this wrong, but I think I'm right in saying that the 5th percentile in this country, so those are the people who are poorer than 95% of people and richer than only 5% of people, their income in real terms basically has not increased for decades, not since the 1950s. That's astonishing. So, we were a lot richer than we were in the 1950s in general, and yet these people at the bottom, they're not richer at all. So any stress on them is a serious problem. So partly this is about the distribution of gains in the economy as a whole. Partly this is about the security and the environmental efficiency of our energy system. So are we dealing with climate change? Are we actually going to be able to keep the lights on? The political classes have been able to just postpone and postpone and postpone really hard choices on this. And then there's a question as to and this is a much narrower and in some ways I think very uninteresting question, but I clearly has some impact. Are the energy companies somehow colluding or able to reap massive profits from us? Is competition working? And as far as I can make out, it's working okay. It probably could be a bit better. Probably would be nice to have 1 or 2 more significant players. But I don't see that as fundamental to the system, to the problem. What I see as fundamental to the problem is deep down energy prices, the price of generating electricity, the cost of sourcing gas is going up at the moment. The measures that we're putting in place too late to deal with climate change and to deal with the fact that all these nuclear power stations being mothballed, we need new energy generation, they are, in the short term, only going to raise prices further. And we've done nothing very satisfactory about the distribution of gains in this country over the last 50 years, which means that there are certain people who are under tremendous stress. So I think that is the fundamental problem. I'd like to see the Competition Commission take a look at energy suppliers, but I do not think... you said the profits are up 70%. I haven't looked at the data, but I think you probably find that's up 70% from not that much to quite a bit more. I think if the profits were 0, we'd still be paying a lot for our energy, and people would still be suffering. So we need to look deeper, while of course not missing the opportunity to give energy companies a good kicking. So I think we've got time for 1 or 2. There's a gentleman there. Anyone else? Anyone from the top? No? Okay, cool.
Thank you. What you concluded on was that there was a sort of Phillips attitude in which you can find a solution to any problem, or is it the other way around?
Take it outside, guys. We don't want to hear it here.
And you sort of derive that from Phillips' experiences with mechanics and how you can take a system, alter it slightly, and make it go from being broken to being fixed. But I don't really think that translates into economics, because this engineering perspective, it totally ignores any kind of aspects it ignores trade-offs in economics. So yeah, you can sort out your inflation and you can sort out your unemployment, but then you screw yourself in the other way around. And I just fail to see that this engineering perspective translates into an economic practicality and something you can actually do in economics. And I would suggest that maybe we're sort of limited to always, gaining here and losing here.
Sure. Okay.
We can't ever move forward. Sorry, that sounds so negative. But
thank you. No, that's fine. Thank you. And Ramesh from the Intertubes.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions come in from Shabaz Razak, who's president of the Brunel Economics and Finance Society, so I think we should take one of them, which is when the UK government uses fiscal policy to bring the economy out of recession, what is the impact on employment, the price level, and the fiscal deficit? So I guess broad question around issues of policy to tackle
What is this? Is this the essay that the Brunel Economic Society are currently answering? Gosh, okay. I'm not going to. I can't even remember the question. I'm not going to grasp with that. It was a perfectly legitimate question, but that starts to get. I have to sort of draw out all the macro textbooks and so on. What I would say is I'd slightly question the premise of the question. The premise of the question being, when the UK government uses fiscal policy to bring the economy out of recession. I mean, the UK government has not used fiscal policy to bring the economy out of recession. The UK government appears to have been driven by a belief that fiscal policy either is irrelevant or can't, or there's no room for manoeuvre and it can't be used, even though it would be nice. And so they've not used it, and the economy has recovered anyway. I personally think that was a mistake. I think they should have used fiscal policy. I think they had room to use fiscal policy. I think and I think it would have worked. And I think that if they had done that, the economy would have shrunk less and started growing sooner. But I think we need to be realistic that, well, A, not every economist agrees with me, but B, we just suffered an absolutely catastrophic shock to the economy. And even if George Osborne had got things absolutely perfectly by whatever my standards, by anybody's standards, we'd still be in a very difficult situation. So I think that they could have handled it better, but I do not think we can give George Osborne the blame for all of this recession, for the depth of it, for the length of it. I think at worst, his critics could accuse him of contributing to a small part of it through inappropriate fiscal policy. That is my view. It is not, for instance, the official view of the Financial Times, so we do disagree. There are the editorials, which express the official view of the Financial Times, and which I no longer write. There's a question there that I don't want to ignore, but sorry, one more question I can...
Yeah. Hi. You talked about Phillips's machine and how in classrooms you mixed two economies from two different countries and how the different fiscal and monetary decisions in either one would affect either one. We've talked a lot about China, and it's clearly the big macroeconomic story of our time. You've also done some prophesizing about what different scenarios China might see, demographic problems, etc., etc. What do you think the future Chinese scenario might mean for the UK's future?
I think that the current situation is that everything that China sells is falling in price, and everything that China buys is rising in price. So this is not a great situation for the Chinese to be in. Steel, coal, etc. The price of these things, oil, the price of these things are rising. The price of the stuff that China's trying to export keeps falling. There's this cost pressure. So, that's tricky for China. The effect on the UK, I don't know. I think it's possible to exaggerate this. China is one of many markets we want to deal with. Many places we could sell goods to. One of many places we could buy goods from. The Chinese economy is now... I think bigger than the British economy. It's not a lot bigger than the British economy. I mean, it's about the size of the Japanese economy at the moment, and about half the size of the American economy. It depends exactly how you measure these things. So, we need to think about China, but we need to think about India, we need to think about Indonesia, we need to think about Eastern Europe, Turkey, very important, Egypt, North Africa, Nigeria. And how we're going to deal with all of these places and what we're going to sell to them and what we're going to buy from them, I think, is reasonably imponderable. I do worry that the UK economy has become too dependent on financial services, which experience suggests you don't want to be too dependent on anything, whatever it is, whether it's wheat or oil or dodgy insurance products. Whatever it is, you do not want your economy to be too dependent on that, because you then lack resilience, you lack the ability to bounce back. Whereas if you've got a broader base of different products and services you produce, you've got more resilience. So let me return to this man's question about whether was Bill wrong to think of the economy as an engineering system, and was Bill wrong to think that there was something we could do to make the economy work better? I think these are two separate questions. I think it's fair to say that there are limits to applying engineering to economics, and we've bumped up against them. There's complexity science, I think that's very important. Agent-based modeling, trying to understand that. Evolution in economic systems, it's really a much better way of understanding technological change. The engineering perspective doesn't give you a very good handle on technological change. I mean, we've tried to model it, but it's not very convincing. There's psychology. I mean, there was no psychology in the Phillips machine. But economists of Phillips' generation were interested in psychology. Keynes was very interested in psychology, but it sort of became very unfashionable in economics, and it's just coming back in. So, yeah, I mean, engineering only takes you so far. There are many, many other perspectives. And that's why economics is such an incredible and wonderful and, I find, fulfilling, if frustrating, subject. There's this famous line that Keynes came up with where he said that to be a master economist, you need to be a diplomat, you need to be able to talk with the great and powerful, but you need to be able to deal with people as they go through the ordinary business of life and understand what's going on the shop floor or the coal face, and you need to be able to be logical and to analytical and to use mathematics. But you also need to be able to write in English and to understand these softer concepts that can't necessarily be mathematically explained. And you need to be able to see into the future, but you also need to have a very firm grasp of the past. I mean, to be an economist, you need to just master all of human life, because that's what economics is about. It's about human life and how we get along together and what we create together and how this amazing system that we've built around us works or doesn't work with tremendous consequences. And I think that's something that it wasn't embodied in the Phillips machine, but it is embodied in the best economic thinking, which is why it's such a wonderful subject to study. The suggestion that there's nothing we can do when an economy goes wrong, I reject. I think that has become fashionable in some parts of economics, and I think it's absolutely wrong. And we know there are many ways in which economies can fail. Externalities, failures of distribution, and we know that these things have solutions. And we also know that these solutions aren't always easy, that the details matter tremendously. They're trying to get things right. There may be a process of fumbling, a process of trial and error to get them right. But I don't think anybody can look at the amazing economic growth that's taken place in many, many countries, and also the amazing economic catastrophes that have occurred in some places, and just say, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing that can be done. It's just a trade-off. You pays your money, you takes your choice. This is a system that can work well and that can work badly. And it's a system that we, as economists, have a responsibility to try to understand and to try to guide. We need to be humble. There's nothing, we'll never understand the system, and we'll never understand it perfectly. We'll never be able to control it and to prevent recessions. But there will always be something that we can do to make the world a better place. We live in an economic world. We live in a world where economic performance is tremendously important to all of us. And if economists are not willing to engage with that and to try to deal with those problems, then I don't know who is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. I mean, that was a tour de force as a lecture, and I have to say, a very inspiring note on which to finish, both on the scope for economics to make the world a better place, but also the limitations that we face as economists. And I think the emphasis on humility at the end there was very appropriate. I should say, I mean, before I joined the Bank of England, I had 20 years as an academic at the London School of Economics, and the Phillips machine was actually just adjacent to where my office was. And I have had the pleasure of actually seeing it in operation with all the fluids sloshing around and so forth. And I would strongly recommend any of you who do pass the Science Museum to make the effort to go and see it. It is actually it's a pretty fantastic contraption, but also in its way inspiring, as indeed was the career of Bill Phillips that Tim has talked about tonight. So can I thank Tim once again for a really great lecture. And don't forget, the Undercover Economist Strikes Back is available at all good bookstores.
Thank you all very much for coming. There is a drinks reception now for about an hour outside where people will be mingling, though I think we'll have to give Tim a little break for a few minutes. But you're very welcome to come.